A Blood Vow Between Enemies. Aurora Darasi had spent her life pretending she was safe, that her last name protected her. But when she uncovered a secret she was never meant to find, she made the mistake of thinking she could run. Now, Tommaso Benedetti stood in her doorway, his voice low, knowing. "You should have stayed hidden, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Because now I'll make sure you never run again." Chapter 1. The Illusion of Sanctuary. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Darasi estate. Aurora Darasi, a woman whose age sat gracefully upon her like a fine wine, at 58, moved through the sprawling gardens with a practiced ease, her fingers tracing the velvety petals of a blood-red rose. The air, thick with the scent of late summer blooms and the distant tang of the sea, usually calmed her, but today, a persistent unease clung to her like a shroud. For 58 years, Aurora had lived within the protective embrace of her family name, Darasi, a name whispered with respect, fear, and a healthy dose of suspicion throughout the city and beyond. Her father, Don Lorenzo Darasi, had ruled his empire with an iron fist and a velvet glove, ensuring his only daughter was shielded from the darker realities of their world. Or so she had believed. She paused by a marble fountain, its water cascading with a soothing rhythm that failed to quiet the turmoil within her. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, revealing the sharp angles of her face and the intelligent, haunted depths of her hazel eyes. She wore a simple, elegant cream-colored dress, its understated luxury a testament to her upbringing. But beneath the surface of composure, a storm brewed. The discovery had been accidental, a misplaced file in her late husband, Marco's, study. Marco, a respected lawyer, had been the perfect buffer between Aurora and the family business. He had died 5 years ago, of a sudden heart attack, leaving Aurora adrift in a sea of grief and, unbeknownst to her, secrets. The file contained details of a transaction, a transfer of funds, a coded message, and a name she hadn't recognized, linked to a rival family, the notorious Benedettis. It was a betrayal, clear and undeniable, a crack in the foundation of everything she had ever believed in. The Benedettis were their sworn enemies. A blood feud, generations deep, had separated the two families. She'd initially dismissed it as a mistake, a clerical error. But the more she delved, the more undeniable the truth became. Someone within the Darasi family was working with the enemy, and the implications were terrifying. Her fingers tightened around the smooth marble edge of the fountain. She had tried to ignore it, to bury the knowledge deep within her, to return to the carefully constructed illusion of safety. But the truth, once unearthed, had a way of taking root, its tendrils of doubt wrapping around her heart, squeezing the air from her lungs. She had made the foolish, impulsive decision to run, to escape the suffocating weight of her family legacy, to disappear into the anonymity of a life she had never known. She had packed a small bag, withdrawn a significant amount of cash, and booked a one-way ticket to a remote village in Tuscany, a place where she hoped the name Darasi held no power. But the Darasi family had eyes everywhere. And running, she now realized, was the worst possible thing she could have done. It was an admission of guilt, a challenge to the very foundations of their power. A shadow fell over her, and she turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the setting sun, his presence radiating an aura of controlled power and undeniable menace. Tommaso Benedetti. Even in the fading light, she recognized him. The chiseled features, the dark, intense eyes that seemed to see straight through her, the air of quiet authority that sent a shiver down her spine. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps in his late 30s, but his face held a weariness that belied his years, etched with the lines of a life lived on the edge. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, the fabric whispering wealth and power, a stark contrast to the casual elegance of the Darasi men she knew. He moved with a predatory grace, his steps silent on the manicured lawn. The distance between them closed, and Aurora felt a primal fear grip her, a cold dread that seeped into her bones. She had seen him only a handful of times at carefully orchestrated, neutral ground meetings between the families years ago. He had always been a silent observer, a shadow in the background, but she had never forgotten the intensity of his gaze, the feeling that he saw more than he let on. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking with hers. There was no anger in his expression, no overt threat, only a chilling calmness that was far more unsettling. "You should have stayed hidden, Dulcezza," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. The Italian word of endearment, sweetness, felt like a cruel mockery, a poison barb. Aurora straightened her shoulders, refusing to cower. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. A faint smile played on his lips, a flicker of amusement that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't insult my intelligence, Aurora. We both know why you ran." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "I ran because I needed to get away. To think. To grieve." "Grieve?" He raised an eyebrow, his disbelief evident. 5 years after your husband's death? "No, Aurora. You ran because you found something you weren't supposed to find." Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the garden. She had underestimated him. She had underestimated them all. "I found nothing," she insisted, her voice losing some of its conviction. He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. The scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something darker, more dangerous, filled her senses. "The file, Aurora," he said softly, his voice like velvet over steel. "The transaction. The name." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She couldn't deny it any longer. He knew. It was a mistake, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He shook his head, his eyes holding hers captive. "There are no mistakes in our world, Aurora. Only choices. And choices have consequences." The weight of his words, the truth in them, crashed down on her. She was trapped, caught in a web of her own making, and the spider was closing in. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. His smile widened, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "I want to understand," he said. "I want to know why a Darasi would risk everything to betray her family." "I didn't," she began, but he cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Aurora," he said, his voice hardening. "I despise liars." She looked away, unable to meet his intense gaze. The tears she had been holding back for so long finally welled up, blurring her vision. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek, a surprisingly gentle touch that made her flinch. "Don't cry, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Tears won't help you now." She pulled away from his touch, her fear giving way to a flicker of defiance. "What will help me?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. He stepped back, his eyes still fixed on hers, a strange mixture of coldness and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "The truth," he said. "Tell me the truth, Aurora. And maybe, just maybe, I can help you." His words hung in the air, a promise and a threat intertwined. She knew she had no choice. She was at his mercy. He tilted his head, studying her with an unnerving intensity. "Because now," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I'll make sure you never run again." The weight of his stare pressed down on her. Would telling the truth truly free her, or was it just another trap, far more intricate than the last? Chapter 2. Whispers in the Shadows. The grand dining room of the Dirassi estate, usually a scene of boisterous family gatherings, felt cold and cavernous. Aurora sat at one end of the long, polished mahogany table, a single place setting laid out before her. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving light, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air and the emptiness of the room. Tommaso Benedetti sat opposite her, a silent, watchful presence. A lone servant, Maria, an elderly woman who had served the Dirassi family for decades, placed a plate of pasta alla norma in front of Aurora. The rich aroma of eggplant, tomatoes, and ricotta salata, usually a comforting scent, did little to settle her churning stomach. "Eat," Tommaso said, his voice devoid of any warmth. You need your strength. Aurora picked at the food, her appetite gone. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the distant sounds of the city. I told you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know anything about the Benedettis. The file, it was a mistake. Tommaso leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on her. He untouched his own food, a simple plate of grilled fish. You're lying, Aurora. And you're not very good at it. She pushed her plate away, the food untouched. Why are you doing this? Why bring me back here? Because you ran, he said simply. And running makes you look guilty. Guilty of something. I told you why I ran. I needed to get away. To clear my head. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Clear your head? Or escape the consequences of your actions? She flinched. I haven't done anything. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. The file, Aurora. The name. Salvatore. Does that name mean anything to you? Aurora's breath caught in her throat. Salvatore. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, a name buried deep in the recesses of her memory. Salvatore, her cousin. Her disgraced cousin. Salvatore is dead, she said, her voice trembling. He died years ago. In disgrace. Did he? Tommaso asked, his voice soft, dangerous. Or was he simply removed? Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. Salvatore had been exiled from the family, stripped of his title and his inheritance, after a failed attempt to usurp her father's power. The official story was that he had died in a car accident in South America. But there had always been whispers, rumors that his death had been arranged. I don't know, she whispered. I was told he was dead. And you believed it? Tommaso asked, his voice laced with skepticism. You, Aurora Derasi, believed the official story? She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She had believed it. Or rather, she had wanted to believe it. It was easier, simpler, to accept the official narrative than to delve into the murky depths of family secrets. What does Salvatore have to do with the Benedettis? She asked, her voice gaining a little strength. Tommaso smiled, a cold, predatory smile. That dolcezza is what I intend to find out. He gestured to Maria, who had been standing silently by the door. Bring us some wine, Maria. And then leave us. The old woman hurried to obey, her movements swift and practiced. She poured 2 glasses of a deep red wine, a Barolo from the Derasi family's private cellar, and then retreated, closing the heavy oak doors behind her. Tommaso raised his glass. To the truth, he said, his eyes meeting Aurora's. May it set us both free. Aurora hesitated, then picked up her own glass. The wine tasted like blood on her tongue. I don't know what you expect me to tell you, she said. I've told you everything I know. Everything? Tommaso asked, his voice soft, probing. Or everything you want to remember. He took a sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving hers. Tell me about your husband, Aurora. Tell me about Marco. Aurora's hand trembled, spilling a few drops of wine on the tablecloth. Marco. The one person she had truly loved, the one person who had made her feel safe, protected. Marco was a good man, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He had nothing to do with any of this. Are you sure? Tommaso asked. He was a lawyer, Aurora. A very successful lawyer. He knew the ins and outs of the family business. He knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak. He wouldn't, she began, but her voice trailed off. She had always believed in Marco's integrity, his unwavering loyalty. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing, its tendrils wrapping around her heart. Wouldn't he? Tommaso asked, his voice gentle, persuasive. Or wouldn't you want him to? Aurora closed her eyes, fighting back the tears. She remembered Marco, his warm smile, his gentle touch, the way he had always made her feel loved, cherished. Could he have been involved? Could he have betrayed her? Betrayed the family? I don't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know anymore. Tommaso leaned forward, his gaze intense. Tell me about your father, Aurora. Tell me about Don Lorenzo. Aurora opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. Her father. The man who had shaped her life. The man who had ruled their world with an iron fist. My father was a complicated man, she said, her voice slow, deliberate. He was a man of honor, of loyalty. But he was also ruthless. He did what he had to do to protect the family. And what did that entail, Aurora? Tommaso asked. What did he have to do? She hesitated, her mind flooded with memories, images of her father, his stern face, his piercing gaze, the way he had always commanded respect, fear. He made sacrifices, she said, her voice barely audible. For the good of the family. Sacrifices, Tommaso repeated, his voice laced with irony. Like Salvatore? Aurora flinched. I don't know, she whispered. I wasn't involved in those decisions. But you knew, Tommaso said, his voice soft, relentless. You knew what your father was capable of. You knew what your family was capable of. She looked away, unable to deny it. She had always known, deep down, that their world was built on a foundation of secrets, lies, and violence. But she had chosen to ignore it, to live in the illusion of sanctuary, to pretend that she was safe. Tell me, Aurora. Tommaso's voice was barely a whisper, brushing against her ear. Did you ever wonder if Marco's death was truly an accident? The question hung in the air, the silence deafening, the truth or a terrifying possibility beginning to take a monstrous shape. Chapter 3. A gilded cage shattered. The silence that followed Tommaso's question was suffocating, pressing down on Aurora like a physical weight. The image of Marco, lying pale and lifeless in his study, flashed through her mind. The doctors had called it a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. She had been devastated, lost in a sea of grief. She had never questioned it. Until now. What are you suggesting? She asked, her voice trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. Tommaso leaned back, his expression unreadable. I'm not suggesting anything, Aurora. I'm simply asking questions. Questions that you should have asked yourself a long time ago. Marco loved me, she said, her voice a desperate plea. He would never have love as a powerful motivator. Dolcezza. Tommaso interrupted, his voice soft, yet laced with steel. But so is fear. And so is ambition. He paused, letting his words sink in. Your husband was a very ambitious man, Aurora. He had a taste for the finer things in life. Things that his legal practice, even a successful one, couldn't always provide. Aurora shook her head, trying to deny the implications of his words. He had everything he needed. He had me. Did he? Tommaso asked, his eyes searching hers. Or did he always crave more? More power, more influence, more security? He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. Her skin crawled at his contact, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away. Think, Aurora, he said, his voice low and persuasive. Think about the last few months before Marco died. Was he acting differently? Was he more stressed, more secretive? She closed her eyes, trying to recall the details, the subtle nuances of his behavior. She had attributed his stress to work, to the pressures of his legal practice. But now, looking back, she remembered things she had dismissed at the time. Late-night phone calls, hushed conversations, a growing distance between them. He was preoccupied, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He said he was working on a big case, a complicated one. And you believed him? Tommaso asked. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. I wanted to, she said. I trusted him. Trust is a luxury we can rarely afford, Aurora, he said, his voice hardening. Especially in our world. He released her hand, and she immediately felt the loss of his touch, a strange, unsettling emptiness. What do you think happened? She asked, her voice trembling. Tommaso leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I think your husband stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. Something that put him in danger. Something that ultimately cost him his life. But what? She asked, her voice desperate. What could he have found? Tommaso smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. That, Dolcezza, is what we're going to find out. Together. Together? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Why would you help me? You're a Benedetti. We're enemies. He raised an eyebrow. Enemies? Perhaps. But we also share a common goal, Aurora. We both want the truth. And I have a feeling that the truth will lead us to the same place. And what place is that? She asked. To the person who betrayed your family, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The person who is working with the Benedettis. The person who may have been responsible for your husband's death. Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. The idea that someone within her own family, someone she had trusted, could be capable of such treachery was almost unbearable. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The file, Salvatore's disappearance, Marco's death, it all pointed to a conspiracy, a betrayal that went far deeper than she had ever imagined. Who? She asked, her voice barely audible. Who do you suspect? Tommaso's eyes narrowed. I have my suspicions, he said. But I need proof. And that's where you come in, Aurora. You have access. You have knowledge. You can help me find the answers. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice defiant. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that sent a shiver down her spine. You won't, he said. Because you want the truth as much as I do. And because you have nowhere else to go. He was right. She was trapped, caught between her loyalty to her family and her desperate need for answers. She had no choice but to trust him, a man who was her sworn enemy, a man who held her fate in his hands. Her carefully constructed world, the gilded cage of her family name and supposed protection, had shattered. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and, strangely, a flicker of something else. Excitement? He stood up, his tall figure towering over her. Come, Aurora, he said, his voice soft, yet commanding. We have work to do. The question was, could she truly believe anything he said, or was this entire scenario his seeming concern, his offer of assistance the most elaborate trap of all? Chapter 4. The Price of Freedom. The library of the De Rossi estate was a sanctuary of old-world charm. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that exuded the scent of aged paper and wisdom. A large fireplace dominated one end of the room, its cold hearth a stark reminder of the chill that had settled over Aurora's life. Tommaso stood by the window, gazing out at the darkened gardens, his back to her. This room, Aurora said, her voice echoing in the stillness, was my father's favorite. He spent hours here, reading, planning, ruling. Tommaso turned, his eyes sweeping over the room, taking in the details. A fitting place for a king to hold court, he said, his voice devoid of any sarcasm. He wasn't a king, Aurora said, a touch of defensiveness in her voice. He was a businessman. Tommaso raised an eyebrow. A businessman with a very particular set of skills, he said. And a very loyal family. Loyalty is everything, Aurora said, the words echoing her father's mantra. Is it? Tommaso asked, his voice challenging. Or is it simply a convenient way to control people? Aurora didn't answer. She had never questioned the concept of loyalty, the unwavering devotion to family that had been drilled into her since birth. But now, for the first time, she wondered if it was more a prison than a virtue. Where do we start? She asked, changing the subject. Tommaso gestured to a large, ornate desk in the center of the room. Your husband's study, he said. That's where you found the file, correct? Aurora nodded. Yes, but I searched it thoroughly after I came back. There's nothing else there. Perhaps, Tommaso said. But we'll look again. A fresh perspective can often reveal things that were previously overlooked. He moved to the desk, his movements purposeful and efficient. He began to examine the drawers, the shelves, the various objects that cluttered the surface. Aurora watched him, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. What exactly are we looking for? She asked. Anything that doesn't belong, Tommaso said. Anything that seems out of place, unusual, suspicious. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of a framed photograph on the desk. It was a picture of Aurora and Marco, taken on their wedding day. They were both smiling, their eyes filled with love and hope. He loved you, Tommaso said, his voice surprisingly soft. I can see it in his eyes. Aurora looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze, the painful reminder of what she had lost. It doesn't matter now, she said, her voice choked with emotion. It always matters, Tommaso said. Love, betrayal, loyalty, these are the forces that drive us, that shape our destinies. He continued his search, his movements methodical and precise. He opened drawers, sifted through papers, examined every object with a meticulous attention to detail. Aurora felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she was intruding on a sacred space, violating the memory of her husband. I don't like this, she said, her voice trembling. It feels wrong. Tommaso stopped, his eyes meeting hers. The truth often feels wrong, Aurora, he said. But it's necessary. It's the only way to find peace. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It was a diary, one that Aurora had never seen before. What's that? She asked. Tommaso opened the journal, his eyes scanning the pages. It appears to be your husband's, he said. A personal diary. Aurora's heart pounded in her chest. Marco had kept a diary? She had never known. It felt like another betrayal, another secret he had kept from her. Read it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso began to read, his voice low and even. The entries were mostly mundane accounts of his daily life, his work, his thoughts. But as he continued, the tone of the diary began to change. There were hints of anxiety, of fear, of something he couldn't quite articulate. He was worried, Tommaso said, his eyes still fixed on the pages. He felt like he was being watched, followed. Aurora's blood ran cold. By whom? She asked. Tommaso didn't answer. He continued to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he stopped, his eyes widening. Here, he said, his voice sharp. He mentions a meeting. A secret meeting with someone he refers to only as S. Aurora's heart skipped a beat. S? She repeated. Salvatore? Tommaso nodded. It's possible, but it could be someone else. Someone we haven't considered. He closed the diary, his eyes meeting Aurora's. This changes everything, he said. Your husband wasn't just a bystander, Aurora. He was involved. He was playing a dangerous game. But why? She asked, her voice desperate. Why would he risk everything? Tommaso's expression was grim. That's what we need to find out, he said. And I have a feeling that the answer is going to be far more complicated and far more dangerous than we ever imagined. He tucked the diary into his inside jacket pocket. We need to leave, he said, his voice urgent. Now. A sense of foreboding settled over her, a cold certainty that finding the truth was going to cost them far more than they were prepared to pay. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. The drive was silent, tense. Tommaso navigated the winding coastal roads with a practiced ease, his focus unwavering. Aurora sat beside him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the fragmented pieces of information they had unearthed. Marco's diary, the mysterious S, the growing suspicion that her husband's death had been no accident, it was all too much to process. Where are we going? She finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. Tommaso glanced at her, his expression enigmatic. To a place where we can talk, he said. A place where we can be discreet. He didn't elaborate, and Aurora didn't press him. She trusted his instincts, his knowledge of the underworld, even though she still didn't fully understand his motives. They arrived at a small, secluded villa overlooking the sea. It was a picturesque setting, with whitewashed walls, terracotta tiles, and a vibrant garden overflowing with bougainvillea. But the beauty of the place did little to ease Aurora's anxiety. Tommaso led her inside, to a simply furnished living room with large windows offering breathtaking views of the ocean. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of salt and sea air. This is yours? Aurora asked, looking around. Tommaso nodded. A safe house, he said. One of many. He gestured to a comfortable sofa, and Aurora sat down, feeling the exhaustion of the past few days settling over her. Tommaso sat opposite her, his gaze intense. We need to talk about Salvador, he said, his voice direct. Aurora's heart clenched. Salvatore. Her cousin, the black sheep of the family, the man who had been exiled and supposedly died years ago. I told you, she said, her voice weary. I don't know anything about him. I was told he was dead. But you don't believe that anymore, do you? Tommaso asked, his voice gentle, probing. Aurora shook her head. No, she whispered. I don't. Tell me about him, Tommaso said. Tell me about your relationship with him. Aurora hesitated, her memories of Salvatore a tangled web of emotions. He had been her childhood playmate, her confidant, her first love. Before the family rivalry had consumed them both. We were close, she said, her voice soft, nostalgic. When we were young, we spent summers together, playing in the gardens, exploring the estate. He was different from the other men in the family. More sensitive, more artistic. She paused, remembering the way Salvatore had always encouraged her to pursue her own interests, her love of painting, her desire for a life beyond the confines of their family legacy. He understood me, she said, her voice choked with emotion, in a way that no one else ever did. And then? Tommaso asked. And then, Aurora said, her voice hardening, he betrayed us. He tried to take my father's place. He was exiled. And he died. Did you ever see him again? Tommaso asked. After he was exiled? Aurora shook her head. No, she said. I was forbidden to contact him, to even speak his name. But you thought about him, Tommaso said, his voice knowing. Aurora looked away, unable to deny it. She had thought about Salvatore often, wondering what had become of him, if he was truly dead, or if he was living somewhere far away, under a different name. He was my cousin, she said, her voice defensive. It was natural to wonder. And to mourn, Tommaso added, his voice soft. Aurora didn't answer. She had mourned Salvatore, not just his death, but the loss of the bond they had shared, the loss of the future they had once dreamed of. Tommaso leaned forward, his gaze intense. I believe Salvatore is still alive, he said. And I believe he's involved in this. In the betrayal of your family. In your husband's death. Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. The thought that Salvatore could be alive, that he could be capable of such treachery, was almost unbearable. But why? She asked, her voice desperate. Why would he do this? Tommaso's expression was grim. Revenge, he said. Power. Money. The usual motives. He paused, his eyes searching hers. But there's something else, he said. Something more personal. Something that connects him to you, Aurora. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Tommaso reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a photograph, old and faded, but the image was still clear. It showed Aurora and Salvatore, standing together in the gardens of the De Rossi estate, their arms around each other, their faces filled with youthful joy. I found this in your husband's diary, Tommaso said. Hidden between the pages. Aurora took the photograph, her fingers trembling. She remembered the day it was taken, the last summer they had spent together before everything had changed. Why would Marco have this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso's expression was unreadable. That's what I intend to find out, he said. But I have a feeling that this photograph, this connection between you and Salvatore, is the key to unlocking the truth. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And I think, Aurora, that your cousin didn't just want to usurp your father. I think he always wanted you. The implication hung in the air, a chilling echo of a forgotten past, a past that was now threatening to consume her present. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Embrace. The revelation about Salvatore's possible obsession with Aurora hung heavy in the air, casting a long, dark shadow over their already precarious situation. The idyllic setting of the villa, with its breathtaking ocean views, felt increasingly claustrophobic, a gilded cage of a different kind. I don't understand, Aurora said, her voice shaking, her hands clutching the faded photograph. Salvatore and we were close, but it was innocent, like brother and sister. Tommaso watched her, his expression a mixture of skepticism and something else, something that resembled pity. Perhaps that's what you believed, Aurora, he said gently. But love, especially the forbidden kind, can take many forms. It can fester, twist, become something obsessive. He paused, letting his words sink in. Your husband knew about Salvatore's feelings for you. He kept this photograph, a reminder of a past that threatened his present. Aurora shook her head, trying to deny the implications. Marco wouldn't have been jealous of Salvatore. He knew I loved him. Did he? Tommaso asked, his voice soft, probing. Or did he always fear that a part of you, a part of your heart, still belonged to your cousin? The question struck Aurora like a physical blow. She had loved Marco, deeply, passionately. But there had always been a part of her, a secret, hidden corner of her heart, that held the memory of Salvatore, the innocent, carefree love they had shared before the world had intruded. It was a long time ago, she said, her voice defensive. It meant nothing. It meant something to Salvatore, Tommaso said. And it meant something to your husband. Enough for him to keep this photograph, to investigate your cousin's past, to stumble upon something dangerous. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the vast expanse of the ocean. We need to find Salvatore, Aurora, he said, his voice firm. He holds the answers. He knows who betrayed your family. He knows what happened to your husband. But how? She asked, her voice desperate. He's been gone for years. He could be anywhere. Tommaso turned, his eyes meeting hers. I have resources, he said. Contact. I can find him, but it will take time. And it will be dangerous. Dangerous for whom? She asked. He smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. For everyone involved, he said. For you, for me, for Salvatore, for the person who is pulling the strings. He paused, his gaze intense. We need to be careful, Aurora. We need to trust each other. Because we're surrounded by enemies. And we don't know who they are. His words sent a shiver down her spine. She was caught in a web of deceit, betrayal, and hidden agendas, and she had no idea who to trust. Even Tommaso, the man who was supposedly helping her, remained an enigma, his motives shrouded in mystery. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice filled with suspicion. Why are you helping me? What's in it for you? Tommaso's expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. I told you, he said. I want the truth. And I believe that finding Salvatore is the key to uncovering it. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? She pressed. There's something you're not telling me. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. There are complications, he said. Family matters. Things that are difficult to explain. Try me, Aurora said, her voice firm. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. The Benedettis and the Derossis, he said. We have a history. A long and bloody history. I know that, Aurora said. We're enemies. Enemies, Tommaso repeated, his voice laced with irony. But also connected. In ways that you can't imagine. He paused, his eyes searching hers. My father, he said, his voice low and strained. He had dealings with your family. With your father. With Salvatore. Aurora's eyes widened. What kind of dealings? She asked. Tommaso's expression was grim. The kind that leave scars, he said. The kind that create debts. The kind that can never be repaid. He turned away, his back to her, his shoulders tense. I'm not like my father, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I want to break the cycle of violence, of betrayal. I want to atone for the sins of the past. Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. She saw a glimpse of something beneath the surface, a hint of vulnerability, of pain, that resonated with her own. I believe you, she said, her voice soft. He turned back, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of surprise in his expression, followed by something that resembled gratitude. Thank you, Aurora, he said. He walked towards her, stopping just inches away. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a featherlight touch that sent shivers down her spine. But be careful who you trust, Dolcezza, he whispered. Because in this world, even the closest allies can become the deadliest of enemies. He lowered his hand, his eyes still locked with hers. The air crackled between them, a strange mixture of fear and something else. Something dangerous. The serpent's embrace was tightening, and she wasn't sure if she was being protected or slowly, meticulously devoured. Chapter 7. Unveiling the Mask. The villa, once a haven, now felt like a pressure cooker. Tommaso had spent the afternoon making calls, hushed conversations in rapid Italian that Aurora couldn't fully follow. The names he mentioned, Falcone, Rizzo, Bellini, were unfamiliar, yet they carried a weight, a sense of power and danger that made her uneasy. She paced the living room, restless, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. The photograph of her and Salvatore lay on the coffee table, a constant reminder of the past that was now threatening to destroy her present. Tommaso finally hung up the phone, his expression grim.
"I've made contact," he said, "with someone who might know where Salvatore is."
Aurora's heart skipped a beat. "Who?"
she asked.
"And where?" "A former associate of your cousin's," Tommaso said. "A man named Enzo. He lives in Naples. He's reluctant to talk, but I've persuaded him to meet with us."
"Persuaded?"
Aurora asked, her voice laced with suspicion.
"How?"
Tommaso smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "Let's just say I have methods," he said. "Methods that are effective, but not always pleasant." Aurora shivered, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath Tommaso's controlled exterior. He was a Benedetti, after all, a man raised in a world of violence and treachery. "We leave tonight," he said. "Under the cover of darkness. It's safer that way." Aurora nodded, her apprehension growing. Naples. The heart of the Camorra, the Neapolitan Mafia. It was a dangerous place, a world away from the sheltered life she had always known. "What if Enzo doesn't know anything?" she asked. Tommaso's eyes narrowed.
"He knows something," he said.
"He's afraid. And fear is a powerful motivator. It makes people talk." He paused, his gaze intense. "But we need to be prepared, Aurora. For anything. This could be a trap. A setup. A setup by whom?" she asked. "By anyone," Tommaso said. "By Salvatore, by the person he's working with, by someone within your own family." The thought sent a chill down her spine. The possibility that someone she had trusted, someone she had loved, could be involved in this conspiracy was almost unbearable. "Who do you suspect?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "I have my suspicions," he said. "But I need proof. And I don't want to influence your judgment." He walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. "There's one person, though," he said, his voice low and strained, "who has always been close to your family. Someone who had access to everything. Someone who benefited from your husband's death." Aurora's mind raced, trying to think of who he could be referring to. There were many people who fit that description, relatives, close associates, family friends. "Who?" she asked, her voice desperate. Tommaso turned, his eyes meeting hers. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, his expression troubled. "No," he said, shaking his head.
I won't say it. Not yet."
"Not without proof." He walked back to the coffee table and picked up the photograph of Aurora and Salvatore. He studied it for a moment, his expression unreadable. "This photograph," he said, his voice soft. "It tells a story, Aurora. A story of love, of betrayal, of obsession." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and something else. Something that resembled desire. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And you still are." Aurora felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She hadn't expected that, the sudden shift in his demeanor, the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," she said, her voice awkward. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a featherlight touch that sent shivers down her spine. "Be careful, Aurora," he said, his voice low and intense. "Be careful who you trust. Because in this world, beauty can be a weapon, and love can be a curse." He lowered his hand, his eyes still locked with hers. The air crackled between them, a palpable tension, a dangerous attraction that was growing stronger with each passing moment. But there was also fear, a deep-seated unease that she couldn't shake. He broke the gaze, turning away from her, his expression hardening. We need to go, he said, his voice brisk. It's time. The mask was back in place, the charming, vulnerable man replaced by the cold, calculating mafioso. And Aurora wondered which was the real Tommaso Benedetti and which was the performance. Or were they inextricably, dangerously intertwined? Chapter 8. Scars of Loyalty. The journey to Naples was a blur of darkened highways, hushed conversations, and a growing sense of dread. Tommaso drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror, alert for any sign of pursuit. Aurora sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind racing. They arrived in Naples in the early hours of the morning, the city shrouded in a thick layer of fog. The narrow, winding streets, usually teeming with life, were eerily deserted. The air was heavy with the scent of exhaust fumes, stale coffee, and something else, something indefinable, a hint of danger that made Aurora's skin crawl. Tommaso parked the car in a dimly lit alleyway behind a nondescript building that looked like it had seen better days. This is it, he said, his voice low. Enzo's place. Aurora looked at the building, her apprehension growing. It looked like a trap, a place where secrets were kept and lives were lost. Are you sure about this? She asked, her voice trembling. Tommaso nodded.
He's expecting us, he said.
He knows we're coming. He got out of the car, and Aurora followed, her legs feeling unsteady. He led her to a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and weathered. He knocked 3 times, a specific rhythm, a signal. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a small, wiry man with a nervous expression and eyes that darted around constantly. He was older than Aurora expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with a weathered face and a thin, graying mustache. Tommaso, the man said, his voice raspy. You came. Enzo, Tommaso replied, his voice calm, yet firm. This is Aurora Derossi. Enzo's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his fear palpable. Derossi? He repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. What is she doing here? She's with me, Tommaso said. She's here to ask you some questions. About Salvatore. Enzo's gaze shifted to Aurora, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and fear. I don't know anything, he said, his voice shaking. I haven't seen Salvatore in years. That's not what I heard, Tommaso said, his voice hardening. I heard you were close. That you helped him disappear. Enzo's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about. Tommaso stepped closer, his presence intimidating. Don't lie to me, Enzo, he said, his voice low and dangerous.
I know you know something.
And I'm not leaving until you tell me. Enzo looked from Tommaso to Aurora, his eyes filled with desperation. He was trapped, caught between 2 powerful forces, and he knew it. Please, he said, his voice pleading. I have a family. I don't want any trouble. Then tell me the truth, Tommaso said.
Tell me where Salvatore is. Tell me what happened to him.
Enzo hesitated, his gaze darting around nervously. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt at any moment. I can't, he whispered. He'll kill me.
Who will kill you?
Aurora asked, her voice surprisingly steady.
Salvatore?
Enzo shook his head. No, he said. Not Salvatore. The other one. The one who controls him. Aurora's heart skipped a beat. The other one? She repeated. Who is the other one? Enzo's eyes widened with terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he froze, his gaze fixed on something behind Aurora. Aurora turned, following his gaze, and saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a cold, cruel face. He was dressed in black, his features obscured by the darkness, but there was something familiar about him, something that sent a shiver of recognition down Aurora's spine. It was Riccardo, her father's consigliere, his most trusted advisor, the man who had been like an uncle to her all her life. Riccardo? Aurora said, her voice filled with disbelief. What are you doing here? Riccardo smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm here to protect the family, Aurora, he said. To protect you from yourself. He raised his hand, and Aurora saw the glint of metal, the cold, hard steel of a gun. He aimed it not at Tommaso, but directly at her. The scars of loyalty, she realized, ran far deeper and were far more treacherous than she could ever have imagined. Chapter 9. A Dance with Danger. The sight of Ricardo, his familiar face twisted into a mask of cold menace, holding a gun aimed at her, paralyzed Aurora with shock and disbelief. Her mind struggled to reconcile the image of the man she had known and trusted all her life with the deadly threat he now posed. "Ricardo," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Put the gun down. What are you doing?" His smile widened, a cruel, predatory expression that sent shivers down her spine. "I told you, Aurora," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "I'm protecting the family, protecting our interests." Tommaso, who had been standing silently beside Aurora, moved swiftly, stepping in front of her, shielding her with his body. "Ricardo," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't be a fool. This doesn't concern you." Ricardo's gaze shifted to Tommaso, his eyes filled with contempt. "You," he sneered. "The Benedetti bastard. You think you can interfere in our affairs? You think you can protect her?" "She's under my protection," Tommaso said, his voice unwavering. "And I won't let you harm her." "You have no power here, Benedetti," Ricardo said. "This is De Rossi territory, and you're trespassing." He gestured with the gun, indicating Enzo, who was cowering in the doorway, his eyes wide with terror. "Get rid of him," Ricardo ordered, "and then we'll deal with the girl." Enzo, seeing his chance to escape, scrambled back inside the building, slamming the door shut behind him. "You won't get away with this, Ricardo," Aurora said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a surge of anger and defiance. "My father would never," Ricardo cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Your father?" he scoffed. "Your father was a weak, sentimental old fool. He let his emotions cloud his judgment. He let you cloud his judgment." "What are you talking about?" Aurora asked, her confusion growing. "He should have dealt with Salvatore years ago," Ricardo said, his voice filled with bitterness. "He should have eliminated the threat. But he couldn't. Because of you. Because of your attachment to that traitor." "Salvatore is my cousin," Aurora said. "He was family." "He was a cancer," Ricardo said, his voice venomous. "A disease that threatened to destroy everything we had built. And I had to cure it." Aurora's blood ran cold. "You?" she whispered. "You were the one who exiled him?" Ricardo nodded. "I orchestrated his downfall," he said. "I made sure he was removed. Permanently." "But he's alive," Aurora said. "Tommaso believes he's alive. And he's involved in this and Marco's death." Ricardo's eyes narrowed. "Your husband," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Another weak link. Another fool who stumbled upon something he shouldn't have." "You killed him," Aurora said, her voice trembling with rage. "You killed Marco." Ricardo smiled, a chilling, self-satisfied smile. "He was a liability," he said. "He knew too much. He was going to expose us." "Expose what?" Aurora asked, her voice desperate. "What is it that you're hiding?" Ricardo's gaze flickered to Tommaso, then back to Aurora. "It's not your concern, Dolcezza," he said, his voice mocking. "It's a family matter. Something you wouldn't understand." He raised the gun again, aiming it directly at Aurora's heart. "It's time to end this, Aurora," he said. "You've caused enough trouble. You've become a liability." Tommaso, who had been standing motionless, his eyes fixed on Ricardo, suddenly moved. With lightning speed, he lunged forward, grabbing Ricardo's wrist, twisting the gun away from Aurora. The two men struggled, their bodies locked in a deadly embrace. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the narrow alleyway. Aurora screamed, her hands flying to her ears. The struggle was short, brutal. Tommaso, younger and stronger, overpowered Ricardo, disarming him, sending the gun skittering across the pavement. Tommaso held Ricardo in a tight grip, his forearm pressed against his throat, his eyes blazing with fury. "You should have stayed away, old man," he growled. But Ricardo just laughed, a hoarse, rattling sound. "You think you've won, Benedetti?" he gasped. "You think this is over?" He looked at Aurora, his eyes filled with a chilling, knowing gleam. "Ask him, Aurora. He choked out. Ask him about his father. Ask him about the deal. Then his body went limp. Chapter 10. The Heart's Reckoning. Ricardo's words hung in the air, a poisonous cloud that choked the already tense atmosphere. Aurora stared at Tommaso, her mind reeling, her heart pounding in her chest. The fight had been swift, brutal, and the sudden silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and Ricardo's labored, then absent, breathing. Tommaso released Ricardo's lifeless body, letting it slump to the ground. He turned to Aurora, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and troubled. "Tommaso?" she said, her voice trembling. "What did he mean? What deal? What about your father?" He didn't answer, his gaze shifting away from hers. He looked down at Ricardo's body, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Tommaso, please," Aurora pleaded, her voice desperate. "Tell me, what's going on?" He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, regret, and something else, something that resembled shame. "It's complicated," he said, his voice strained. "It's a long story. I have time," Aurora said, her voice firm. "And I deserve to know the truth. After everything that's happened, I deserve to know everything." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He seemed to be wrestling with himself, struggling to find the words. "My father," he finally said, his voice low and heavy, "and your father, they had a pact. An agreement. A long time ago." "What kind of agreement?" Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A business agreement," Tommaso said. "A way to share power, to control territory, to eliminate rivals." "And Salvatore?" Aurora asked. "Where does he fit into this?" Tommaso's expression darkened. "Salvatore," he said, his voice filled with bitterness, "was the catalyst. The trigger." He paused, his gaze shifting away from hers again. He seemed to be lost in the past, reliving painful memories. "Your father," he continued, his voice strained. "He wanted Salvatore out of the way. He saw him as a threat. To his power, to his legacy." "But why involve your father?" Aurora asked, her confusion growing. Tommaso's eyes met hers, his gaze intense. "Because your father needed help," he said. "He needed someone who could get the job done. Someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty." "And your father agreed?" Aurora asked, her voice trembling. Tommaso nodded. "He agreed," he said. "For a price." "What price?" Aurora asked, her voice barely audible. Tommaso hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He seemed to be struggling with something, a deep-seated conflict that was tearing him apart. "The price," he finally said, his voice low and strained, "was you." Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. "Me?" she whispered. "What do you mean?" "Your father," Tommaso said, his voice filled with pain. "He offered you as a bride. To Salvatore. To seal the deal. To ensure his loyalty." Aurora's blood ran cold. She felt like she had been punched in the gut, the air knocked out of her lungs. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." "My father would never." "He did," Tommaso said, his voice firm. "He did it to protect the family, to protect his power, to secure his legacy." Aurora felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the foundations of her life crumbling beneath her feet. Her father, the man she had idolized, the man she had believed in, had betrayed her. He had used her, bartered her like a piece of property. "But Salvatore was exiled," she said, her voice trembling. "He disappeared." "He was supposed to disappear," Tommaso said. "He was supposed to die. But he survived. And he's been waiting, planning, biding his time." "And your father?" Aurora asked, her voice desperate. "What happened to him?" Tommaso's expression darkened. "He died," he said. "A few years after the deal. A sudden illness. Some say it was natural causes. Others believe differently." "You think he was murdered?" Aurora asked. Tommaso nodded. "I do," he said. "By someone who wanted to erase the past. Someone who wanted to silence him." "Ricardo?" Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso's eyes met hers, his gaze intense.
Perhaps, he said.
Or perhaps someone else. Someone even more powerful. Someone who is still pulling the strings. He looked down at his hands, stained with Ricardo's blood. A single tear rolled down Aurora's cheek, followed by another and another. The reckoning had come, not just for her, but for her heart, for everything she thought she knew. Was anything in her life ever real? Chapter 11. Between Two Worlds. The weight of Tommaso's revelation pressed down on Aurora, crushing her with the force of a physical blow. The world she had known, the carefully constructed reality she had inhabited for so long, had shattered into a million pieces, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty and betrayal. They left Ricardo's body in the alleyway, a grim testament to the violence that had erupted. Tommaso drove them away from the scene, his movements swift and efficient, his focus unwavering. Aurora sat beside him, numb with shock, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what she had learned. They returned to the safe house, the villa overlooking the sea. The beauty of the setting, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cruel mockery, a reminder of the idyllic life she had lost. Tommaso poured them both a drink, a strong whiskey, and handed one to Aurora. She took it, her hand trembling, the liquid burning her throat as she swallowed. "I don't understand," she said, her voice hoarse. "Why are you telling me all this?
Why are you helping me?"
Tommaso sat down opposite her, his gaze intense. "Because I owe you the truth," he said. "Because my father wronged you."
"He wronged your family."
"But you're a Benedetti," Aurora said. "We're supposed to be enemies." He smiled, a sad, weary smile. "Enemies?" he repeated.
"Perhaps.
But we're also victims, Aurora. Victims of our father's sins. Victims of a legacy of violence and betrayal." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I want to break the cycle," he said.
"I want to atone for the past.
I want to find peace." "And you think finding Salvatore will do that?" Aurora asked, her voice skeptical. Tommaso nodded.
"He holds the key," he said.
"He knows who is behind all of this. He knows who killed your husband. He knows who betrayed your father." "And what if he's the one who betrayed us?" Aurora asked. "What if he's the one who's been pulling the strings all along?" Tommaso's expression darkened. "Then we'll deal with him," he said. "We'll make him pay." Aurora looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that resembled admiration. He was a dangerous man, a man capable of violence, but he was also a man of honor, a man who was trying to do the right thing. "I don't know who to trust anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Everyone I thought I knew, they've all betrayed me." Tommaso reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You can trust me, Aurora," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I promise you. I won't let anything happen to you." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, but the scars of betrayal ran deep, making it difficult to trust anyone.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this for me?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He seemed to be struggling with something, a deep-seated emotion that he was reluctant to reveal. He looked back up at her. "Because," and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Aurora's breath caught in her throat. His words, so unexpected, so shocking, sent a wave of emotion through her, a mixture of fear, confusion, and a flicker of something else, something that resembled hope. She was caught between two worlds. The familiar world had collapsed, leaving her stranded in a landscape shaped by Tommaso, by the Benedettis, by a past she was only beginning to understand. Could she truly trust this? And, more importantly, could she trust herself? Chapter 12. Threads of Deception. Tommaso's confession hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering bubble that Aurora was afraid to touch, lest it burst and leave her exposed once more. His words, so unexpected, so raw, had shaken her to her core, stirring up a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to decipher the truth behind his declaration. Was it genuine? Or was it another manipulation, another layer of deceit in a world where trust was a dangerous illusion? Tommaso, she said, her voice trembling, I don't know what to say. He smiled, a sad, tender smile that reached his eyes. You don't have to say anything, Aurora, he said. I know it's sudden, unexpected, and perhaps inappropriate. Inappropriate? She repeated, a flicker of anger rising within her. After everything that's happened? After everything we've been through? I know, he said, his voice apologetic. It's not the right time. It's not the right place. But I can't deny it any longer. I can't pretend that I don't feel something for you. He paused, his gaze intense. I know you've been hurt, Aurora, he said. I know you've been betrayed. And I know it's difficult for you to trust anyone. Especially me. Especially you, she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. But I'm not my father, he said, his voice firm. I'm not Ricardo. I'm not Salvatore. I'm me. And I would never intentionally hurt you. Aurora looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Her heart was a battlefield, torn between her fear of betrayal and a growing, undeniable attraction to this complex, dangerous man. I need time, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I need time to process everything, to figure out what I feel. Tommaso nodded, his expression understanding. I understand, he said. Take all the time you need. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the sea. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the water, a breathtaking spectacle that seemed to mock the turmoil within her. We still have to find Salvatore, he said, his voice turning businesslike again. We still have to uncover the truth. Aurora nodded, her mind still reeling from his confession. She knew he was right. They couldn't let their personal feelings, whatever they might be, distract them from their mission. What's the next step? She asked. Tommaso turned, his eyes meeting hers.
I've made some inquiries, he said.
I have a lead. A possible location. Where? Aurora asked.
A small town, Tommaso said.
In the mountains. Far from here. A place where he could disappear. A place where he could hide. And you think he's there? Aurora asked. Tommaso nodded. I do, he said. I have a feeling. He paused, his gaze intense. But it's dangerous, Aurora, he said. We'll be walking into the lion's den. We'll be exposed. I'm not afraid, Aurora said, her voice surprisingly firm. After everything she had been through, fear seemed almost irrelevant. Tommaso smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I know you're not, he said. You're stronger than you think, Aurora. You're a Derasi. And you're remarkable. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. We'll go together, he said. We'll face this together. Aurora looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and something else. Something that resembled hope. Perhaps, amidst the ruins of her old life, a new one was beginning to emerge. A life filled with danger, yes, but also with possibility. But as she looked into his eyes, a nagging question persisted. Could she truly trust this feeling, this burgeoning connection, or was it just another thread in the intricate web of deception that surrounded her? Chapter 13. The Weight of Secrets. The drive to the mountain town was long and arduous, the winding roads treacherous, the scenery both breathtaking and foreboding. The higher they climbed, the more isolated they became, the world shrinking to a narrow ribbon of asphalt and the vast, unforgiving expanse of the mountains. Aurora sat beside Tommaso, her thoughts a jumble of fear, anticipation, and a growing sense of unease. The closer they got to their destination, the more she felt the weight of the secrets they were carrying, the burden of the past that was now threatening to crush them. Tell me more about Salvatore, she said, her voice breaking the silence. Tell me about the deal. The one my father made with your father. Tommaso hesitated, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He seemed reluctant to delve into the details, to revisit the painful memories. It was a long time ago, he said, his voice evasive. It's not relevant anymore. It is relevant, Aurora insisted. It's relevant to me. It's relevant to everything that's happened. Tommaso sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. Very well, he said. But it's not a pretty story. He paused, his expression grim. Your father, he said, he wanted to expand his empire. He wanted to control more territory, more businesses. But he had rivals. Enemies.
People who stood in his way.
And Salvatore was one of them? Aurora asked. Tommaso nodded. Salvatore was ambitious, he said. He wanted power. He wanted to take your father's place. But he wasn't strong enough. He wasn't ruthless enough. So my father used him? Aurora asked. He used him, Tommaso confirmed. He manipulated him. He set him up. And your father helped him? Aurora asked, her voice trembling. Tommaso nodded again. My father, he said, his voice filled with bitterness. He was a businessman. He saw an opportunity. A way to profit from your father's ambition. And the price was me? Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso's gaze met hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. Yes, he said. The price was you. A marriage alliance. To seal the deal. To ensure Salvatore's loyalty. Aurora felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been a pawn, a bargaining chip, in a game of power and greed. But it never happened, she said. The marriage, it never took place. No, Tommaso said.
Salvatore disappeared.
He was exiled.
He was presumed dead. But he wasn't, Aurora said.
He survived. And he's been waiting, planning, biding his time. Yes, Tommaso said. And now he's back. And he wants revenge. Revenge on whom? Aurora asked. On my father?
On me?
On everyone, Tommaso said. On everyone who wronged him. On everyone who stood in his way. He paused, his gaze intense. And he's not alone, Aurora, he said. He has allies. Powerful allies. People who are helping him. Who? Aurora asked, her voice desperate. Who are these allies? Tommaso hesitated, his expression troubled.
I don't know, he said.
Not yet. But I'm working on it. I'm trying to find out. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. We'll figure it out, Aurora, he said. Together. We'll uncover the truth. Aurora looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. She had come to rely on him, to depend on him, in a way she had never thought possible. He was her protector, her confidant, her lover. The thought was still new, still scary. But as they drove deeper into the mountains, into the heart of darkness, she knew that she would need him more than ever to survive. The weight of the secrets was heavy, but she wasn't alone. At least, she hoped she wasn't. Because if she couldn't trust Tommaso, who could she trust? Chapter 14. A flicker of hope. They arrived in the mountain town as dusk was settling, the air crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. The town was small, isolated, a cluster of stone buildings huddled together against the backdrop of the towering peaks. It felt like a place out of time, a place where secrets could be easily hidden and lives easily forgotten. Tommaso parked the car on a deserted side street, near a small, unassuming pensione. This is it, he said, his voice low. This is where my contact said Salvatore might be staying. Aurora looked at the pensione, her apprehension growing. It looked like a place where people came to disappear, to escape the world, to hide. Are you sure about this? She asked, her voice trembling. Tommaso nodded. I'm not sure of anything anymore, Aurora, he said. But we have to start somewhere. We have to follow the trail. He got out of the car, and Aurora followed, her legs feeling unsteady. He led her to the entrance of the pensione, a heavy wooden door with a faded sign above it. Inside, the pensione was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and old furniture. A middle-aged woman with a tired expression sat behind a small reception desk, reading a newspaper. Tommaso approached the desk, his demeanor calm and confident. He spoke to the woman in Italian, his voice low and persuasive. Aurora couldn't understand the words, but she could sense the tension in the air, the unspoken questions and answers. The woman looked at Aurora, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She said something to Tommaso, her voice hesitant. Tommaso nodded, his expression grim. He turned to Aurora. She says there's a man staying here, he said. A man who fits Salvatore's description. He's been here for a few weeks. He keeps to himself. He doesn't talk much. Aurora's heart skipped a beat. Is it him? She asked. Is it Salvatore? Tommaso shrugged.
We don't know yet, he said.
But it's a possibility. He turned back to the woman and spoke to her again, his voice firmer this time. The woman hesitated, then reached under the desk and pulled out a key. She handed it to Tommaso. Room 7, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso took the key, his eyes meeting Aurora's.
Let's go, he said.
They climbed a narrow staircase to the second floor, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The hallway was dimly lit, the air heavy with silence. They reached room 7, the door slightly ajar. Tommaso paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked at Aurora, his expression serious. Be careful, Aurora, he said. We don't know what we're walking into. He pushed the door open and they stepped inside. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a small table, and a chair. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in shadow. A figure sat in the chair, his back to the door. He was tall and thin, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders. He didn't move, didn't speak.
Salvatore,
Aurora said, her voice trembling. The figure slowly turned, his face emerging from the shadows. Aurora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was him. It was Salvatore. He looked older, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes were the same intense, piercing gaze that she remembered from her childhood. Aurora? He said, his voice hoarse, disbelieving. Is that really you? Aurora nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. It's me, Salvatore, she said. It's me. He stood up, his movements slow and unsteady. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. I can't believe it, he said, his voice choked with emotion. After all these years, I thought I'd never see you again. He looked at Tommaso, his eyes narrowing. Who is this? He asked, his voice suspicious. He's with me, Salvatore, Aurora said. He's helping me. Salvatore's gaze lingered on Tommaso, his expression unreadable. Helping you? He repeated. Helping you with what? With everything, Aurora said. With finding you. With uncovering the truth.
Salvatore smiled. Assad, where is smile?
The truth?
He said.
The truth is a dangerous thing, Aurora. Especially in our world. He paused, his gaze intense.
But I'm glad you're here, he said.
I'm glad you found me. For the first time in a long time, Aurora saw a flicker of hope. But was it real, or just another illusion in a world built on lies? The reunion was bittersweet, filled with both relief and a deep, unsettling foreboding. Chapter 15. The Lion's Denver. The reunion with Salvatore was fraught with tension, a delicate dance between past affection and present suspicion. He looked at Aurora with a mixture of longing and regret, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. But there was also something else, something guarded, something hidden beneath the surface. Why did you run, Salvatore? Aurora asked, her voice breaking the silence. Why did you disappear? He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I had no choice, Aurora, he said. I was betrayed. By my own family. By your father. He said you tried to usurp him, Aurora said. That you tried to take his place. Salvatore shook his head. That's not true, he said. It was a lie.
A fabrication. To get rid of me. To silence me. But why?
Aurora asked. Why would he do that? Salvatore's expression darkened. Because I knew too much, he said. I knew about the deal. The agreement he made with Tommaso's father. Aurora glanced at Tommaso, who was standing silently by the window, his expression unreadable. What deal? Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Salvatore's eyes met hers, his gaze intense. A deal that involved you, Aurora, he said. A deal that sealed your fate. I know about the marriage arrangement, Aurora said.
Tommaso told me. Salvatore nodded.
Yes, he said.
But there was more to it than that.
Much more. What do you mean? Aurora asked, her voice trembling. Salvatore hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He seemed to be struggling with something, a deep-seated secret that he was reluctant to reveal. Your father, he finally said, his voice low and strained. He wasn't just protecting his power, Aurora. He was protecting something else. Something far more valuable.
What?
Aurora asked, her voice desperate. What was he protecting? Salvatore's eyes met hers again, his gaze filled with a mixture of sadness and fear.
He was protecting a secret, he said.
A secret that could destroy everything. A secret that cost your husband his life. Aurora's blood ran cold.
Marco?
She whispered. What does Marco have to do with this?
He found out, Salvador said.
He stumbled upon the truth. And he was silenced. Just like I was supposed to be. But who silenced him? Aurora asked. Who killed Marco? Salvatore's gaze shifted to Tommaso, his expression unreadable. Ask him, he said. Ask Tommaso. He knows. He knows more than he's telling you. Aurora turned to Tommaso, her eyes filled with questions, with suspicion, with fear.
Tommaso?
She said, her voice trembling. Is it true? Do you know who killed Marco? Tommaso didn't answer, his gaze fixed on Salvatore. The two men stared at each other, a silent battle of wills, a clash of past grievances and present dangers. Tell her, Tommaso, Salvatore said, his voice challenging. Tell her the truth. Tell her about your family's involvement. Tell her about your father's sins. Tommaso's expression hardened. You have no right to speak of my father, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I have every right, Salvatore said. He ruined my life. He destroyed my family. And he used you, Aurora. He used you both. Enough, Tommaso said, his voice rising. I won't listen to your lies. They're not lies, Salvatore insisted. They're the truth. The truth that your father and your family have been trying to hide for years. He turned to Aurora, his eyes pleading. Believe me, Aurora, he said. I'm not your enemy. I never was. I loved you. I still do. Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. She didn't know who to believe, who to trust. Salvatore, her childhood love, the man who had been betrayed and exiled, or Tommaso, the man who had saved her, the man who had confessed his love for her. She was in the lion's den, surrounded by predators, and she had no idea which one was going to strike next. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the weight of decades of secrets finally coming to light. She was the center of it all, the prize, and she couldn't escape the feeling that she was about to be devoured. Chapter 16. Crossroads of Fate. The tension in the small room was thick, suffocating, a palpable force that pressed down on Aurora. The two men, Salvatore and Tommaso, stood locked in a silent battle, their eyes filled with a mixture of animosity, distrust, and something else, something that resembled a shared history of pain and betrayal. Tommaso, Aurora said, her voice trembling, please, tell me the truth.
What does Salvatore mean?
What did my husband find out? Tommaso hesitated, his gaze shifting from Salvatore to Aurora. He seemed to be wrestling with himself, struggling to decide what to reveal, what to conceal. It's complicated, he said, his voice strained. It's not something I can easily explain. Try, Aurora insisted, her voice firm. I deserve to know. I need to know. Tommaso sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. He looked at Salvatore, his expression filled with resentment. Your husband, he finally said, his voice low and heavy. He discovered a connection. A connection between your father, my father, and a third party. A third party? Aurora repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Who? Tommaso hesitated again, his gaze shifting away from hers. A powerful organization, he said. A group that operates outside the law. A group that controls everything. The Mafia? Aurora asked, her voice filled with disbelief. You're saying my father was involved with organized crime? Tommaso nodded, his expression grim.
Not just involved, he said. He was a part of it.
A high-ranking member. A leader. Aurora felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. Her father, the man she had admired, the man she had believed in, was a criminal? A mafia boss? It was impossible. Unthinkable. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not true. It can't be true. It is true, Aurora, Salvatore said, his voice soft, yet firm. Your father was a powerful man. A ruthless man. He did whatever it took to protect his empire, even if it meant sacrificing his own daughter. Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. The world she had known, the carefully constructed reality she had inhabited for so long, was crumbling around her, revealing a dark, sinister underbelly that she had never imagined. And Marco? She asked, her voice trembling. What did he find out? He found out about the agreement, Tommaso said. The agreement between your father and mine. The agreement that involved you. But what was the purpose of the agreement? Aurora asked. What were they trying to achieve? Tommaso's expression darkened.
Control, he said. Power. Money.
The usual things. But there was something else, Aurora. Something more specific.
What?
Aurora asked, her voice desperate. What was it? Tommaso hesitated, his gaze shifting to Salvatore.
Tell her, he said.
Tell her about the Falcone family. Salvatore's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his expression filled with fear. No, he whispered. I can't. They'll kill me. They'll kill us all if we don't expose them, Tommaso said, his voice firm. We have to tell the truth. No more secrets. No more lies. Salvatore looked at Aurora, his eyes pleading.
Don't listen to him, Aurora, he said.
He's manipulating you. He's using you. He's not using me, Aurora said, her voice surprisingly steady. He's helping me.
He's protecting me.
He's protecting himself, Salvatore insisted. He's protecting his family.
He's part of it, Aurora. He's one of them.
Aurora looked from Salvatore to Tommaso, her heart torn. She didn't know who to believe, who to trust. She was at a crossroads, a pivotal moment in her life, and her decision would determine her fate, her future. She had to choose. But how could she choose, when both paths seemed to lead to darkness, to danger, to betrayal? She closed her eyes, desperately trying to find some clarity, some inner guidance. But all she found was confusion, fear, and a growing, unsettling sense of inevitability. Chapter 17. Blood and Tears. Aurora opened her eyes, her gaze settling on Tommaso. There was something in his eyes, a vulnerability, a sincerity that she couldn't ignore. Despite everything, despite the doubts, the fears, the lingering suspicions, she felt a connection to him, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of danger and shared trauma. Tommaso, she said, her voice firm, tell me everything.
Tell me about the Falcone family.
Tell me about your father's involvement. Tell me about Marco. Tommaso nodded, his expression grim. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. He looked at Salvatore, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pity. The Falcone family, he said, his voice low and strained, is one of the most powerful mafia families in Italy. They control everything. Drugs, gambling, prostitution, construction, you name it. And my father was involved with them? Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso nodded again. Your father, he said, was their partner, their ally. He helped them expand their operations. He provided them with protection. He laundered their money. Aurora felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The image of her father, the man she had loved and admired, was being shattered, replaced by a monstrous figure, a criminal mastermind. And your father? She asked, her voice trembling. My father, Tommaso said, his voice filled with bitterness, was their enforcer, their hitman. He did their dirty work. He killed for them. He paused, his gaze intense. And Marco, he said, his voice choked with emotion. He found out about it. He found evidence, documents, recordings, proof of their crimes. And they killed him? Aurora asked, tears streaming down her face. Tommaso nodded. They killed him, he said. They made it look like a heart attack. But it was murder. Cold-blooded murder. But who? Aurora asked, her voice desperate. Who gave the order?
Who was responsible?
Tommaso's gaze shifted to Salvatore, his expression unreadable. Tell her, Salvatore, he said. Tell her who killed her husband. Salvatore hesitated, his eyes filled with fear. He looked at Aurora, his expression pleading. I can't, he whispered. They'll kill me. They'll kill us all if we don't expose them, Tommaso said, his voice firm. We have to tell the truth. Salvatore took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. He looked at Aurora, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. It was Riccardo, he said, his voice barely audible. Riccardo was the one who gave the order. He was working for the Falcons. Aurora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Riccardo, her father's consigliere, the man who had been like an uncle to her, was a murderer? He had killed Marco? He had betrayed her family?
But why?
She asked, her voice choked with emotion. Why would he do that? Because he was ambitious, Salvatore said. He wanted power. He wanted control. He saw an opportunity to take over, to become the new leader. And he used the Falcons to do it? Aurora asked.
Salvatore nodded.
He made a deal with them, he said. He promised them loyalty. He promised them access.
He promised them you.
Aurora stared at him, her mind reeling. She had been a pawn, a prize, in a game of power and greed, a game that had cost her everything. Suddenly, the door burst open, and two men stormed into the room, guns drawn. They were dressed in black, their faces masked, their eyes cold and ruthless. Falcons, Tommaso whispered, his voice filled with dread. The men grabbed Salvatore, shoving him to the ground. One of them pointed a gun at Aurora, his finger on the trigger. Don't move, he growled. Tommaso stepped in front of Aurora, shielding her with his body. Leave her alone, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The man laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. You're in no position to give orders, Benedetti, he said. You're a dead man. He raised his gun, aiming it at Tommaso's head. Aurora screamed. Suddenly, a shot rang out, deafening in the small room. The man holding the gun to Tommaso's head stumbled backward, his eyes wide with surprise, a crimson stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed to the floor, dead. Aurora turned, her eyes wide with shock, and saw Salvatore standing there, a smoking gun in his hand. He had shot the man. He had saved Tommaso's life. But the other man was still standing, his gun trained on them, his finger tightening on the trigger. The room was a tableau of blood and tears, a scene of violence and betrayal that would forever be etched in Aurora's memory. Chapter 18. The Unforgiven. Before the second Falcon gunman could react, Tommaso lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, the gun skittering across the floor, out of reach. Aurora watched in horror, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind paralyzed with fear. Salvatore, still holding the smoking gun, stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He had killed a man. He had crossed a line, a point of no return. Tommaso, despite being caught off guard, fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a deep-seated need for survival. He was younger and stronger than the gunman, and he used his advantage, landing a series of brutal blows, his fists connecting with flesh and bone. The gunman, stunned by Tommaso's attack, struggled to defend himself, his movements sluggish, his breathing labored. Tommaso overpowered him, pinning him to the ground, his forearm pressed against his throat.
Who sent you?
Tommaso growled, his voice filled with rage. Who gave the order? The gunman gasped for air, his eyes bulging, his face turning purple. He didn't answer, his lips sealed in defiance. Tommaso increased the pressure, his forearm cutting off the gunman's air supply.
Tell me,
he demanded, or I'll kill you, right here,
right now.
The gunman's eyes widened with terror. He tried to speak, but only a strangled gurgle escaped his lips. Tommaso, stop, Aurora cried, her voice filled with alarm. You'll kill him. Tommaso ignored her, his gaze fixed on the gunman, his expression merciless. He was consumed by rage, by a thirst for revenge, by a need to punish. Last chance, Tommaso said, his voice low and dangerous. Tell me, who sent you?
Or you die.
The gunman, his face now a ghastly shade of blue, finally managed to gasp out a name.
Falcone, he choked. It was Don Falcone.
Tommaso released his grip, and the gunman collapsed to the floor, coughing and sputtering, his body racked with spasms. Tommaso stood up, his chest heaving, his hands stained with blood. He looked at Aurora, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury and something else. Something that resembled remorse. "I'm sorry, Aurora," he said, his voice hoarse. I lost control." Aurora shook her head, tears streaming down her face.
"It's okay," she said.
You saved us.
You saved me."
She looked at Salvatore, who was still standing there, the gun hanging limply in his hand. He looked lost, confused, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. "Salvatore," she said, her voice soft. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the two dead men on the floor. He had killed a man. He had taken a life. And he knew that he would never be the same. Tommaso walked over to Salvatore and gently took the gun from his hand. He looked at him, his expression filled with a mixture of pity and understanding.
"It's over, Salvatore," he said.
It's finally over. But it wasn't over.
Not yet.
They still had to deal with the Falcones. They still had to expose the truth. They still had to find justice. Aurora looked from Tommaso to Salvatore, her heart filled with a mixture of grief, fear, and a flicker of hope. They had survived. They had endured. But the battle was far from over. The war had just begun. And the price of victory, she knew, would be high. Too high, perhaps. She looked down at her hands, trembling. They were no longer clean. None of them were. The unforgiven. All of them. Chapter 19. Redemption's Call. The aftermath of the violent confrontation was a blur of hurried decisions and frantic actions. Tommaso, taking charge with a decisive efficiency that both impressed and unsettled Aurora, arranged for the disposal of the bodies, erasing any trace of the bloody encounter. He contacted his own network, a shadowy world of loyalties and obligations that existed outside the law, ensuring their escape from the mountain town. Salvatore, shattered by his actions, retreated into a shell of silence, his eyes haunted, his spirit broken. He moved like a ghost, his presence a constant reminder of the violence they had both witnessed and participated in. Aurora, caught between grief, fear, and a growing sense of determination, found herself relying on Tommaso more and more. He was her protector, her confidant, her lover. The lines between their roles had blurred, their connection deepening with each shared experience, each whispered secret. They returned to the villa by the sea, the safe house that had become their refuge, their sanctuary. The beauty of the setting, once a source of comfort, now felt like a fragile illusion, a thin veneer of normalcy over the darkness that surrounded them. Tommaso, ever vigilant, increased their security, reinforcing the villa's defenses, preparing for the inevitable retaliation from the Falcones. He knew that they were marked, targeted, their lives hanging in the balance. "We have to go to the authorities," Aurora said, her voice firm, breaking the tense silence that had settled over them. "We have to tell them everything. We have to expose the Falcones." Tommaso hesitated, his expression troubled. "It's not that simple, Aurora," he said. "The Falcones have influence. They have connections. They can reach anyone. Anywhere. But we have proof," Aurora insisted. "We have Salvatore. He can testify. He can tell them everything." Tommaso looked at Salvatore, who was sitting in a corner, his eyes fixed on the floor, his body lost in a private hell. "He's not in any condition to testify," Tommaso said. "He's traumatized. He's broken." "He'll recover," Aurora said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "He has to. We need him." Tommaso sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I know," he said. "But we need to be careful, Aurora. We need to plan our next move. We can't just rush into this." "But we're running out of time," Aurora said. "The Falcones know we're alive. They know we know the truth. They'll be coming for us." Tommaso nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said. "And we'll be ready for them." He paused, his gaze intense. "But there's something else, Aurora," he said. "Something we need to consider." "What?" Aurora asked, her voice apprehensive. We need to decide what to do about Salvatore, Tommaso said. He's a liability. He's dangerous. He's killed a man. Aurora's heart sank. She knew he was right. Salvatore was a loose end, a wild card, a threat to their safety. But he was also her cousin, her childhood love, the man who had saved Tommaso's life. We can't just abandon him, she said, her voice pleading. I'm not suggesting that, Tommaso said.
But we need to protect ourselves.
We need to ensure our survival. He paused, his gaze searching hers.
There's a place, he said.
A place where he can be safe. A place where he can disappear. A place where no one can find him. Where? Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tommaso's eyes met hers, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and determination.
A place far away from here, he said.
A place where he can start over. A place where he can find redemption. Aurora looked at Salvatore, her heart torn. She knew what Tommaso was suggesting. Exile. Another exile. A repetition of the past. But this time it was different. This time it was a choice. A chance for a new life. A chance for redemption. Was it truly a chance, though, or just another gilded cage? She felt the weight of the decision, the crushing responsibility of choosing between loyalty, love, and survival. It was her call, and she suddenly felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The decision about Salvatore's fate hung heavy in the air, a silent burden that Aurora carried with her every waking moment. She watched him, his broken spirit, his haunted eyes, and her heart ached with a mixture of pity, guilt, and a lingering affection that refused to be extinguished. She knew what Tommaso was suggesting was the logical choice, the safest option for all of them. But it felt like a betrayal, another abandonment, a repetition of the cruelties that had shaped their lives. She found herself drawn to the sea, the vast expanse of water a reflection of her own turbulent emotions. She stood on the cliffs, the wind whipping her hair, the salty spray stinging her face, and she tried to find some clarity, some inner guidance. Tommaso found her there, his presence a silent comfort, a steadying force in the storm that raged within her. Have you decided? He asked, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. Aurora shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know what to do. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. There's no easy answer, Aurora, he said. There's no perfect solution. But we have to do what's best. For all of us. But what is best? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. Is it best to send him away? To exile him again? Tommaso sighed, his gaze shifting to the horizon. It's not exile, Aurora, he said. It's protection. It's a chance for him to start over. To escape the past. But what about us? She asked. What about our future? Tommaso's eyes met hers, his gaze intense. Our future, he said, depends on our survival. And Salvatore, he's a risk.
A danger. To us.
To himself. He paused, his voice softening. I know you care about him, Aurora, he said. I know you love him. But you have to let him go. You have to choose. Aurora looked at him, her heart torn. She knew he was right. She had to choose. Between the past and the present. Between loyalty and love. Between Salvatore and Tommaso. I choose you, she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words a commitment, a surrender, a leap of faith. Tommaso's expression softened, a flicker of relief, of gratitude, in his eyes. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. Thank you, Aurora, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Thank you for trusting me. He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their love. But even as she kissed him back, a part of her mourned, a part of her grieved for the loss of Salvatore, for the loss of the past, for the loss of innocence. They told Salvatore their decision, their voices gentle, their hearts heavy. He listened in silence, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. He knew it was the only way. He knew he had no choice. Tommaso arranged for Salvatore's departure, his network of contacts working swiftly and efficiently, ensuring his safe passage to a remote location, a place where he could disappear, where he could start over. The day of Salvatore's departure arrived, a gray, overcast day that mirrored the mood of those left behind. They stood on the cliffs, watching as a small boat carried him away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he was just a speck on the horizon, and then gone. Aurora watched him go, tears streaming down her face, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and relief. It was over. He was safe. And they were free. But as she turned to Tommaso, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made her blood run cold. A flicker of doubt. A flicker of fear. "What is it?" she asked, her voice apprehensive. Tommaso hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers.
"I don't know," he said. "I have a bad feeling."
A feeling that this isn't over. A feeling that the Falcons are still out there. A feeling that they're coming for us. And as if on cue, a series of gunshots shattered the silence, the bullets whizzing past their heads, embedding themselves in the cliff face. The final confrontation had begun. Hearts and loyalties were on the line, and the cost of survival, Aurora knew, would be paid in blood. Epilogue. The attack was swift, brutal, and unexpected. Tommaso, reacting instantly, pushed Aurora to the ground, shielding her with his body as bullets rained down on them. He returned fire, his movements precise and deadly, his aim unerring. Aurora, huddled on the ground, her heart pounding in her chest, watched in horror as the gunfight unfolded. The idyllic setting, the peaceful cliffs overlooking the sea, had become a battlefield, a scene of violence and chaos. Tommaso, outnumbered but undeterred, fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a deep-seated need to protect the woman he loved. He was a warrior, a survivor, a man who had been forged in the crucible of the underworld. But the Falcons were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. They advanced, their guns blazing, their intent clear, to kill Tommaso and Aurora, to silence them forever. Tommaso, wounded but still fighting, managed to take down several of the attackers, his shots finding their mark with deadly accuracy. But he was running out of ammunition, his strength waning, his fate seemingly sealed. Just when all hope seemed lost, a new wave of gunfire erupted, this time from a different direction. A group of men, armed and ready, emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, their movements purposeful. They were Tommaso's men, his loyal soldiers, his family. They had arrived just in time. The tide of the battle turned. The Falcons, caught off guard, their numbers dwindling, were forced to retreat, their attack thwarted, their mission failed. Tommaso, bleeding and exhausted, collapsed to the ground, his body spent, his spirit unbroken. Aurora rushed to his side, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears. "Tommaso," she cried, her voice filled with anguish. "Are you okay?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and love. He smiled, a weak, weary smile. "I'm alive," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thanks to you." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. "You saved me, Aurora," he said. "You gave me something to fight for." Aurora held him close, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with his blood. She had found love amidst the ruins, hope amidst the despair, a future amidst the ashes of the past. The Falcons were defeated, their power broken, their reign of terror brought to an end. The truth, long buried, had finally been revealed. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Tommaso recovered from his wounds, his body scarred but his spirit stronger than ever. He and Aurora, bound together by their shared experiences, by their love, by their redemption, left the villa by the sea, leaving behind the darkness, the violence, the betrayal. They started a new life, far away from the shadows of their past, a life built on trust, on honesty, on love. They found peace, a fragile, hard-won peace, but a peace nonetheless. They never forgot Salvatore, the lost soul, the exiled prince, the man who had been both a victim and a perpetrator. They hoped that he, too, had found peace, that he had found redemption, that he had found a new life. The cost of betrayal had been high, the scars deep, the wounds lasting. But they had survived. They had endured. They had found love. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the gentle lapping of the waves, a constant reminder of the ever-changing tides of fate, of the enduring power of love, and of the enduring, quiet strength that can arise from the ashes of destruction. The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and purple. A new day would dawn. The end.